I think this will be a relatively short review for my standards, so we start directly with a disclaimer. This review might be quite negative, and I also talk a bit about what that means in my reception for Season 1. I try to be fair, and I can see people liking the episode because as an episode, it was, in my opinion, again, decent, and it had some really good moments, but as the finale of a season of a show called The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, I'm really a bit disappointed. I'm Chris, aka ThePhilosophersGames, and today we'll look into episode 8 of The Rings of Power. Shoutouts to the artists who allowed me to use their fantastic artworks, and spoiler warning, I assume you have seen all episodes. First of all, I'm quite happy that what I said in my predictions video from Wednesday/Thursday was mostly right. I called Halbrand being Sauron, I called the stranger being a wizard and maybe Gandalf, I called the cultists just thinking the stranger being Sauron but being wrong, and I also called the death of Sadok or one of the Harfoots. So currently it feels like I know what I'm talking about and that my analysis was not that bad, though to be fair, some of it was not that hard to call, in a way that also shows that the writers are not writing things in a completely random way and one can predict it. I also want to repeat my prediction from the episode 7 review from last week, 7th or 8th October 2022. Celeborn might be re-embodied in Valinor and sent back to Middle-earth like Lord Findel, maybe to cheer up Galadriel and show the designs of the forces of good. Voice of Geekdom aka Den yesterday added the thought that he might be the hero who fought the Balrog in that Song of Hithaeglir. That or he was imprisoned somewhere. You heard it here first. However, let me start with the positives, then we come to the negatives and problems I have with this episode. I thought some scenes were done pretty well. Cinematography is a star in this show. The soundtrack is great. When Poppy said to Nori, "Why does everyone I love the most always have to go away?" it was heartbreaking. I really hope for Poppy to join Nori on her adventure. I mean, they already went full fan service mode, so why stop here? Still, pretty good scenes. The Sadok death scene I also liked. I appreciate the nuance that he said the missus will be waitin'. And from the episode 3 Harfoot memorial ceremony, we know a Daffodil Burrows was taken by wolves, which we assumed was his wife. So that scene worked out for me too. It's kind of great that the Harfoots, at least for me, remain a part of the show that worked pretty well, even though I feared it would be the part I would like least. Simply because the Harfoots are not a topic of the Second Age. Another scene I liked a lot was the dialogue of Queen Regent Miriel and Elendil, and that being faithful is committing to pay the price. And he says later he makes sure it was worth it, which might hint at future events. It also makes sense that Elendil left Middle-earth. If Isildur is alive and returns to Númenor, that will be a strong moment for Elendil, maybe even showing him that the path of the faithful is worth it in a moment of struggle. I assume that he for now believes that Isildur is dead might push him to contact his other son Anarion. It seemed they also had not the best relationship considering the few mentions of him. I assumed Anarion might live in Andúnir in the west of Númenor, maybe even with his grandfather Amandil, who knows. With the Eregion section I had many problems, but I liked how Galadriel's suspiciousness was built up. I can see people disagreeing with me here, but Celebrimbor using the same phrasing as Adar in the barn in episode 6 worked for me relatively well, though it's not the most elegant way. A power not of flesh, but over flesh. It made sense to get suspicious here for her. That Eregion possesses by accident a scroll about the kings of the Southlands is though a big stretch. Further, I like that Galadriel had to sacrifice her dagger at the end. I saw the twist coming, and Lucas from Tolkien Erklärt predicted it a few days ago already, but I think it was fitting and added something. I also liked how Elrond used the same argument against Gil-galad that the king used for Elrond before. Well played. We also see the Kingspear eyegloss in that scene. I read and translated what is written on it on my channel already. I'll link it in the description. Also, he says something to Galadriel, which I could not really translate. The R at the beginning looks like the Quenya imperative, but I don't know what Tesse means. Maybe a pronoun or some form I don't get. I could not find it anywhere. Cuith could be some form of the word live or to live. I also must admit that the dialogue between Galadriel and Sauron was pretty good too. I also liked the reference from the beginning that the sun once fit in the palm of a hand because the sun was made out of the last fruit of Laurelin, the golden one of the two trees of Valinor. But now we come to the problems, and I won't even talk about classic nonsense we saw so much so far, like riding 850 miles on a horse in 6 days, that are about 140 miles a day. This episode is very fan service heavy, especially with the stranger seeming to be most likely Gandalf, with some classic Gandalf lines like "always follow your nose," which we know from the Peter Jackson films. One could argue when that is the story, it can't be avoided, but it is not the story. Gandalf is not the story of the Second Age. He comes to Middle-earth in the Third Age. Of course, there is a chance left that he is one of the Blue Wizards. In one version, Tolkien wrote very late in his life, shortly before his death, that they came to Middle-earth in the Second Age, and one of them was named Romestamo, which is Quenya and means East Helper, with his friend, the other Blue Wizard, Morinechtar, which is Quenya for Darkness Slayer. They went east and prevented that Sauron's followers there would outnumber the west. With Snorri, the stranger goes to Hrun, which is in the far east, and we know very little about it. It's funnily enough Sindarin and translates to east, so that would fit. Maybe they meet the other Blue Wizard there, or he appears later. However, when it comes to him being Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, it's stated that the Grey Wizard went north, west, and even south, but to the east he did not go. And while the interaction with Feminem and the Nazgûls plus the Harfoots was good, I asked myself, why was this even in the show? Some episodes felt so rushed, and they could have completely left out the Harfoots and focused on the main narrative, because the stranger and the Harfoots had no impact on the actual story at all. Same with Eärien and Kemen, though we might have gotten a hint for Eärien's future development. The decision to include them was, in my opinion, a quite heavy burden for the pacing, and too often the show had to jump back and forth. Then we also had some details that made no sense. So the Nazgûls knew that there were Istari? How? It was a secret council in Valinor that sent those 5 Maiar, basically angels of lower rank, to Middle-earth on a secret mission. They also had to disguise themselves as old men. And yes, maybe the evil forces could have guessed that the Valar, the High Angels, would send somebody, but how on earth do they know the name Istar? One could argue that this is a hint at the Blue Wizards, who were maybe already active in the east, and maybe the stranger is Gandalf, and we'll find out what happened to those wizards next season. But as said, that would contradict the books, and they should not know about the Istari. The only Istar active in the western regions we know of who went to the east as well was Saruman, but I don't see Saruman here. What those 3 cultists were is hard to say. Either the spell of the stranger turned them into something like Wraiths, or it revealed their true nature and destroyed their form. Maybe they were something like Proto-Barrow-Wights. When Tom Bombadil defeats those with his song, he sings, "Shrivel like the cold mist, like the winds go wailing." So one could argue what we see here is at least distantly similar when they dissolve into moths. Wraiths and phantoms otherwise would not be so good at taking a physical form, and the ring wraiths did not exist yet. However, in this context, their teleporting ability makes sense. What speaks against that is them bleeding and moving at sunlight, because Barrow-Wights would not like that, it seems, and even the Nazgûl were weakened by the noon sun. Now we come to the Galadriel section. I think my biggest disappointment is that they really crafted at least the 3 elven rings of power in like 35 minutes of the episode or one afternoon. The creation of the rings of power is one of the biggest, most iconic events in the Second Age. And I guess it's not completed yet, but still, Celebrimbor already created his magnum opus in one episode. The book we are mainly talking about is even called called the Lord of the Rings. I liked the explanation why it should be 3 instead of 2 rings, but I can't help and feel it was very rushed and missed so much potential. What in the timeline of the books is a labor of deception and manipulation by Sauron that is about 100 years long is done in a few days here or an afternoon, and I totally understand that you have to compress the timeline here. But I imagined Sauron had to work for it to earn the trust of the elves for long and use all his skill and patience to reach his goal. In one version, Tolkien wrote, Sauron even had to manipulate Celebrimbor and his guild of ringsmiths, the Gwais y Myrdain, to force Galadriel and Celeborn out of Eregion to finally reach his goals. It's an epic story in my mind. The worst part is Sauron was already there, has done his tricks and is gone again. That was it. The most iconic story part of the Second Age rushed into one episode. Beyond that, we have a Galadriel who finds out who Halbrand is, and she says nothing to the others, except that something is fishy about that guy and that they maybe should make 3 rings instead of 2 and not treat with Halbrand again. Come on. Really? She fights Sauron all her life and knows how dangerous he is, and she holds this information back? She made so much progress as a character. This decision seems completely unbelievable. In the books, the elves only find out about Sauron's identity when he forges the One Ring, so the problem never appears there. Some elves, especially Galadriel, Elrond and Gil-galad, suspect something is wrong, but they don't know who he is in the books. This is now completely different. Also, where are the other 16 rings? Those were forged before the 3 elven rings, and Sauron touched, so tainted the 16 rings himself. This has now become unlikely to happen. In a worst case scenario, they were forged as prototypes off screen, and the worst part is, I would not be surprised if the show would do that. Maybe Sauron makes those rings himself later, but that would heavily collide with what later happens in the story. Also, just let this sink. The whole send Galadriel to Aman part with the ceremony and her swimming and rafting is 26 minutes long. I edited the parts together and checked how long they were. In this part, nothing really happens, and its only purpose is getting Galadriel to Numenor. All that stuff is also not in the books. And the complete forging of the Rings of Power, as said, one of the most iconic moments in Tolkien's universe, and it is in the books, including the big Sauron reveal, was done in about 35 minutes in comparison. For real? How I imagined a long and complex plotline of deception and manipulation and slowly feeding the elves with information, climaxing to the shocking realization that they were used by Sauron, who they worked with for many years and learned from him the whole time. That could have been a plot covering a whole season in my mind. I get that it's impossible to have an outsider be in Eregion and discussing ring crafting with Celebrimbor without everybody knowing, oh, that must be Sauron, but it would be interesting to see how he achieved his goals. Don't get me wrong. The implications of how Sauron manipulated Celebrimbor in episode 8 were great. The actors did it so well, and I like these illusions, which just shows how powerful Sauron is. But that should have been the focus of the season. The way they did it, it felt rushed and seems to me like they did not utilize the full potential. Of course, what might happen in season 2 has to be considered as well. Maybe Sauron returns and in secret instructs Celebrimbor how to make more rings. Maybe Celebrimbor now uses Sauron's designs in secret to make the other 16 rings, because Galadriel did not tell him who Halbrand really was, and it becomes more complex from here. Could be interesting, but from the perspective of season 1 so far, I feel disappointed. How is it possible that a video game depicts this better than a $1 billion series in 8 hours? For me, it's unfortunately not the ultimate episode that elevates Season 1 to a new level, which also was what I expected. There were many theories fans came up with that would have been better, like Sauron already being in Eregion in secret and manipulating Celebrimbor, who brings the ideas of the Dark Lord even to Lindon. I would have liked that more, though as said in my prediction video, I thought for a plot like this it was too late. With only one episode left and establishing a new character and connect all the dots to what was done before, while also the stranger plotline needs a conclusion as well, I could not see that happen in one episode. At least Sauron elaborates a bit on past dialogues and events with Galadriel, and the actors really tried, and I liked that scene as a result. But the stranger learning that he is an Istar, Sauron gifting knowledge to the elves so that the rings could be forged, and the forging itself, the Sauron reveal, all that was a bit much for one episode, especially if we compare it to the slow pacing of the show. Also, what Sauron does is what I want to see. I want to see him at work and how everything unfolds, not the cool stuff happening off screen. So it would also not be a good solution, in my opinion, more a way to salvage what we got. But it didn't happen anyway. On top, they change what is in the books a lot. And though there need to be changes in an adaptation like this, it's always unfortunate if they change things, but the original version of it would have been simply better, or if changes feel unnecessary. Unfortunate is a word I often use when I talk about the show. Rings of Power had potential, it looked impressive, the music was great, the acting was also, at least in my opinion, pretty good. I like the actors, but the script was terrible at times, though sometimes you see a glimpse of greatness, and then you ask yourself, why are they not keeping that level all the time? I guess the show has some good writing talent, but it's maybe on the showrunners that a good and profound vision is missing. They wrote the story with checkboxes in mind, but were not able to develop it in an organic, natural way. They further relied too much on mystery, and at the end I pretty much predicted all mysteries correctly a week before, because it was too obvious. The writing lacked elegance, the writing lacked a goal to that characters were aligned to. For too long it lacked an antagonist, because those had to be kept a mystery for too long. The show was too busy writing setups instead of developing plots. Some parts ate screen time and had no good payoff, and the worst part, some changes compared to the books were absolutely nonsensical. So why change them in the first place? Though they explore a few themes and ideas of Tolkien we have never seen explored in an adaptation before. The dialogue between Galadriel and Adar is a prime example, and it was done well. Most of the time it's sadly not a good Tolkien adaptation. Let us hope, with now the main antagonist of the Second Age established, that Season 2 can at least find a solid structure and tell an actual story instead of chaining confined story checkboxes and spaces together that sometimes work inside themselves but not as a whole. And this has nothing to do with politics. What nonsensical stuff I read over the years. Pretty much nothing of that became true. It did not become Game of Thrones. No nudity. We had like 4 kisses in the show. It had not that much action, though a bit of violence here and there. The actors did a fantastic job as well. Especially Arondir and Disa were absolutely fantastic. At the end, it was a bad script and the inability to tell an actual story and wasting too much time on nonsense that led to weird pacing in many episodes that held the show back. I can't believe I have nothing more to say. Again, an okayish episode. You can have fun with it, but it's sadly burdened by the missteps of the previous episodes and strange writing decisions, like having no antagonist and trying to keep everything secret for 7 hours of Season 1, but also by simply feeling too rushed in comparison. I don't need to see Galadriel climbing an ice wall and fighting a snow troll if the forging of the Rings of Power feels rushed at the end. Terrible focus. At the end, the really good parts and the really bad parts neutralize each other and we'll end somewhere in the middle. That is at least a consistent theme for The Rings of Power Season 1. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed my review. It's quite negative, but it's not like I completely hated watching Rings of Power. I enjoyed some episode, but it's so unfortunate that it wasted so much potential and feels rushed at the wrong places, especially when some of the main plot devices are tough for book fans and they all turn out to be true. We hoped for a lie of Sauron and sadly that was not what we got. Mithril is some magic metal, the elves would have died in a few weeks without the Rings of Power, so they were made out of need, not out of deception, which weakened Sauron's plot. Still, it was fun discussing with you all in the streams and comments. I will slowly return to lore content of Tolkien's books. But there might be a few videos and streams left covering Rings of Power. A detailed analysis stream of episode 8, which might start after this video here released, a watch party on YouTube, longer watch party on Twitch, a detailed analysis of episode 3, maybe a complete season 1 review on the German channel. I'm also again invited to discuss Rings of Power on the channel of the German Tolkien Society. So check those channels out if you're interested. I also post almost all stuff on Twitter and my Discord. Consider pressing the like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and maybe recommend me to other Tolkien fans. Also, thank you for your support. My prediction video got pretty decent views, so I'm quite happy about that. Again, thank you for watching and goodbye.